Cyprus, ruled by Britain for nearly 80 years, but overwhelmingly Greek in population, hits the headlines again as Britain's #1 soldier, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Sir John Harding, arrives to take up his new appointment as Governor General of Crisis Island.
Right from the beginning of British responsibility for Cyprus as a crown colony in 1925, the main political issue on the island had been ethos, union with Greece. And the Greek Orthodox Church had always been very influential in this policy. And so it was a very significant event when in 1950 a Greek bishop, Makarios, was appointed as Archbishop of the Church in Cyprus. And in 1954, he brought to the island a Greek colonel, Colonel Grivas, and charged him with the responsibility for military operations in pursuit of Makarios' aim of getting rid of British colonial rule. And so on the 1st of April 1955, there began a terrorist campaign on the island. It was a typical and ruthless campaign. Indeed, in the course of the emergency, 200 Greek Cypriots were murdered, or as they said then, executed by Grivas and his AOKA terrorists. And so in October of 1955, the British government appointed a new governor and commander-in-chief specifically to deal with this problem. He was Field Marshal Sir John Harding, later Lord Harding, and he went to the island as governor and commander-in-chief in the autumn of 1955. His chief of staff and director of operations was Brigadier Baker, later Sir Geoffrey Baker, Field Marshal Sir Geoffrey Baker, but known throughout the army more familiarly as George Baker. Now, Brigadier Baker wrote, as a result of the Cyprus emergency, a very detailed and comprehensive report dealing with the history of the campaign and the lessons to be learned from it. And on the basis of that report, we are going to discuss the techniques of higher command in war, and specifically in internal security, as illustrated by the Cyprus emergency. Now, Lord Harding, how did you come to be appointed as Governor and Commander-in-Chief?
I was coming to the end of my 3-year stint as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and I was just about to go off to say goodbye to Rhine Army when I was sent for by the Prime Minister.
And Field Marshal, how did you come to be appointed Chief of Staff to Lord Harding?
I was a student at what was then called the Imperial Defence College in London.
Well, a formidable team. Let's have a few brief words on how you prepared yourselves for this great project. What did you do first, Lord Harding?
Well, two things, really. I was strongly advised by the Colonial Secretary, then Alan Lennox Boyd, to take with me a colonial civil servant as the deputy to look after the civil administrative side on the island. So I had to find a chap that I felt I could work with on that score. I also am a very firm believer in the Chief of Staff system, so I decided that I wanted a Chief of Staff in Cyprus, and I busied myself in looking around, finding a chap that I knew, trusted, and felt I could work with, and that was George Baker. On the deputy governor side, they gave me 3 names. I studied their dossiers and decided that a chap called George Sinclair, who was then in the West Coast, was most suited, so I asked for him to be brought back to London as a matter of urgency so that I could see him, talk to him, and find out if we could work together. And that they did, and I decided that he was the man for me. And so I went off a week later to Cyprus with George Sinclair, my wife, and an ADC, and had put in a bid for George Baker to follow me later.
Now, when you were making your preparations, did you have any special conditions or requirements for discharging your responsibilities? Did you, for example, ensure that you would have direct access to the Prime Minister?
Yes, there was one thing that I was quite firm about, that whatever else I had the right of direct access to the Prime Minister, I could report to him and ask him for advice or decisions, and that was agreed to. Generally speaking, I dealt always through the Colonial Secretary, but I did, at one or two occasions, have appeal directly to the Prime Minister. I also wanted to find out what the later... I knew a good deal about the situation in Cyprus, having been a member of the Chief of Staff's Committee, and from the start of the grievous terrorist operations and so on. I knew something about some of the personalities there. I had paid a brief visit to Cyprus during that summer on my way back from Turkey, and seen General Charles Keithley was then Commander-in-Chief there. So I knew a certain amount about what was going on there, and I was particularly anxious to know about what the government's policy was in regard to a political settlement, because the Prime Minister and the Colonial Secretary made it quite clear to me that what they wanted me to do was to restore law and order and to try and reach a settlement on the political issue of the future constitutional situation of the island, primarily with Archbishop Macarius.
What previous experience had you had of this kind of operation, internal security or anti-terrorist operation?
Well, I was Commander-in-Chief of Far East Land Forces from 49 to 51 during the early stages of the Malayan emergency, and I had, of course, a big hand, very much responsibility in connection with that in regard to the command structure, the training of the troops, the reinforcement of the troops, and the relationships between the civil administration, the police, and the army.
So you were going out with some background experience on which to make an appreciation.
Yes, I'd also had a pretty good knowledge of the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya, because that was one of my first problems when I took over at CIGS, and I paid 2 visits to Kenya and tried then to get them to apply the lessons of Malaya in regard to conducting an anti-terrorist campaign to their operations there.
Now, Field Marshal, what was the situation actually like in Cyprus when you and Lord Hardinge went out to begin this operation?
I found in many ways an air of bemusement and confusion. Essentially, nobody was prepared, either for the timing or the scale of the emergency. There was no proper direction as far as the administration was concerned. The police was not well led, the morale was low, the armed services had not really appreciated the sort of trouble that was coming. They were busily occupied, many of them, in fact, in reorganizing part of the Suez base that had been moving to Cyprus. There was a general air of unpreparedness, and basically, I think, because the intelligence organization virtually didn't exist. There was no clear direction at any level. There was no coordination of training or planning between the services and the administration. In fact, it was pretty chaotic.
But to be fair to those who've been there before you, they were facing a new operational situation.
Yes.
Yes. Now, Lord Hardinge, when you arrived, I presume you conducted yourself in a proper military manner and made an appreciation.
Well, it's always been my practice when I take over a new job to make an appreciation of my problem and how I think I ought to set about it. And I did so in this case. Unfortunately, I haven't got a copy of stuff I wrote at the time. But generally speaking, my conclusions were, first, that we had to formulate a policy, a firm, clear policy. We had to make sure that that was promulgated down at all levels and in such a form that it could be clearly understood and interpreted in action at all levels of the organization, the security organization, and then to set to work to forge an instrument with which we could take on the terrorists and defeat them.
Right. Now, I would imagine that the first part of that instrument, which clearly had to be a very highly articulated one, was your actual command and control facilities.
Yes. As I said, I'm a great believer in the Chief of Staff system. And my view is that a Chief of Staff and his commander must be very much in each other's minds and pockets, so to speak. They must be able to talk together, to exchange information. They must have no secrets from each other. And one of the reasons why I chosen George Baker as Chief of Staff was I knew him in the Western Desert to start with, and I knew that he and I could work together on those lines. So that's the first essential. Then the second essential, I think, in an anti-terrorist situation is to have complete, what I call integration. I don't think cooperation is enough. Integration between the three elements that are concerned. That is to say, the civil administration, the police, and the armed forces. And for that, that must go down to all levels. And this is a lesson we learned, of course, in Malaya. And this was the basis on which the anti-terrorist operations were planned and carried out in Malaya from the time that Briggs was appointed Chief of Operations. And that was the foundation on which Old Templar was able to build very successfully.
Now, did you give Brigadier Baker, as he then was, as Chief of Staff, the control over the civil administration and the police and the army directly responsible to you?
Yes. He and the Deputy Governor together. The Deputy Governor was the mouthpiece, so to speak, for the civil administration and the channel through which their activities were organized and geared. But the whole point about it is you must have total involvement in the situation of this kind of everyone concerned. When we went there, as George was saying just now, there was confusion and nobody really knew what the policy was. There was no firm direction from the top. There must be firm direction from the top. There must be the clear policy. We had a fourfold policy in the first instance, which was to maintain law and order in the towns, to safeguard the essential services, communications, telephone system, broadcasting station, and then to seal the island from outside interference by smuggling of arms, ammunition, explosives, and undesirable people. And finally, to forge an instrument which includes the intelligence organization with which we could take on the mountain groups as they then were in the terrorist organization.
Before I come back to you for a brief word on the importance of intelligence in this kind of operation, Field Marshal, were you as committed to the Chief of Staff system as Lord Harding? Did you feel happy operating this kind of system?
Entirely. I found it was absolutely excellent in every way, because I felt that John and I could get in each other's minds. I had complete confidence, obviously, in everything that he told me. And the execution was all that much simpler.
Now, this intelligence business, which whenever one talks to any soldier or expert practitioner in internal security, always comes up. Was it your view that that one of the principal instruments in your battle had to be intelligence?
Oh yes, absolutely, because there was no information really about the terrorist organization. We knew about Guivats, but you didn't know what his organization was, what the structure was, what the strength was, what their armaments were, or anything. And the police had been completely demoralized by AOCA's activities, and their intelligence organization, their special branch, was really non-existent. And so, in order to find something out about AOCA, we decided that we had to cover the island with patrols and listening posts, and in other words, to spread a net over the island of security forces, police and army, and the net had to be complete and the mesh had to be small. And it was by doing that that eventually, after a time, we got a break. A patrol of the Blues stopped a car returning from a raid on the police post up in the northeast part of the island. And the chaps that were there with their weapons, and they talked. And that was the first break we had.
Yes, yeah. On this question of forging the instrument, I noticed in the report which you wrote, Field Marshal, that in April of 1955, the Cyprus Internal Security Committee had been formed. This, your report says, excluded Cypriot members and was composed of the governor, the colonial secretary, the commander of Cyprus district, the air officer commanding, the flag officer Middle East, the director of intelligence, and the commissioner of police. Now, could you say something about how that Internal Security Committee operated?
I wasn't there at that time.
No, quite, but that's the background in your report to your arrival.
Well, clearly, I don't think could have worked very well. The system that John adopted was a very small ad hoc committee of himself, myself, the deputy governor, the director of intelligence, and the chief administrative secretary, and occasionally the attorney general would come in, and we would discuss the immediate problems of the day. There would be no minutes, agendas, and action was the order of the day.
So you didn't make use of this great Internal Security Committee at all?
No, it seemed to me to be top-heavy, and it had no method of dealing with operations. It got no sense of operational urgency, which is a vital consideration. And this applied right through the civil administration. I mean, you take some of the departments, thought they had nothing to do with the emergency. The forestry, for example. Well, they had a great deal to do with it, because they had chaps working and moving in the forest where the terrorist groups were.
Yes.
So you've got to get total involvement of the whole, of the three elements. That's the point I would like to make.
Yes.
In fact, my headquarters was set up in the Secretariat, the Government Secretariat. Certain of these departments almost resented my presence.
Yes.
And the action of troops, get away from me or interfering with my job
Yes.
sort of business.
Just before we leave this business of command, control and intelligence, on the intelligence side, did you have one officer or one person on the island who was responsible solely to you for the collection and collation and dissemination of intelligence?
Not to me, but to George.
I see. And was that a military officer?
No. An officer from one of the security services.
And he collated all intelligence from all sources on the island and was responsible directly to you as Chief of Staff?
Yes.
Yes. And would you say that this is an absolute essential, that you have one Chief of Intelligence who is responsible for the evaluation of all intelligence from all sources?
Absolutely essential.
And he was presumably security cleared to the extent that there was no form of intelligence with which he could not handle.
Intelligence, like security, is indivisible.
Yes.
And you can't say, something that happened in one of the customs offices, for example, is maybe of crucial importance.
Yes. If you believe this, and I certainly agree with you 100%, what about then the actual strength of troops on the ground? It is sometimes said that if your intelligence is good, you don't need quite so many soldiers. What was your evaluation of the strength of your own resources when you got there? Was it adequate?
No, nothing like. You see, as I said just now, you had to spread a net of patrols and posts over the whole island, or the greater part of the island anyway, in order to get the information we wanted. Then there wasn't anything like enough troops for that, and the other thing is the troops were not, in my view, being used in the best way. I mean, they were sent up in what I call village bashing in the mountains, wiping out the signs that everybody, all the people and their supporters wrote on the walls. Well, and that doesn't achieve anything. So I gave an order. One of the orders I gave was that nobody was to bother about stupid signs like death to Harding and so on.
Yeah.
I think another very important factor here on the numbers of troops was that because the police were demoralized, penetrated by Ioka in many senses, and unreliable, the police stations in the early days had to be underpinned by soldiers. Soldiers had to guard all the vital points around the countryside, all those from which the economy of the island or the base depended, power stations, so on. And they had to go in, for instance, and underpin the warders in the prisons, and all this removed a large number of soldiers on static defensive protective duties, which left all the fewer for positive operations in chasing Yoka gangs, particularly in the Taurus Mountains.
So did you in fact ask for any reinforcements?
Oh yes, very much so. And I got what I asked for.
What roughly was it?
I can't remember the detail. Do you remember, George?
Well, just before you went out, John, the initial garrison was 2 battalions, a gunner regiment and an engineer regiment. That garrison was doubled in, I think, August 55. And then steadily we increased. I think we got up to, in all, about 13 units. Some of them were only temporarily lodgers with us, such as the Parachute Brigade, because of possible other commitments, and of course Egypt came up, the Suez campaign. We were reinforced also by a brigade of Royal Marines. We had 3 commanders, which were enormously helpful. I think it was about that number, with considerable reinforcements.
And who was the principal commander, military commander, on the army commander, I mean, now leaving aside the Air Force? Who was the commander of the troops on the ground?
Well, I was the operational...
You were director of operations?
Yes, commander. And I exercised my command through a series of brigadiers. There was one down at Limassol, for example, the Royal Marine headquarters. They were responsible for that part of the island. There was a brigade actually in Nicosia. There was a brigade headquarters in Famagusta. Then there were 1 or 2 independent battalions reporting direct to me, for instance, Kyrenia, Levka.
So you operated as a kind of divisional commander, in a sense, as well as...
In a sense.
Yes.
Anything of internal security was my responsibility,
yes.
and that included the Royal Air Force, where they were allotted or being used for internal security, and also such naval units that came along. And there was an overall operational direction of the police as well.
Yes. Now, Lord Harding, what about training? From what you've said, what you've both said, it seems to me that this force needed a bit of retraining for the kind of operations you had in mind.
Yes, it did. It needed, of course, extensive retraining in 2 directions, really. In observation.
Yes.
In seeing what goes on and reporting what goes on. Anything unusual, of anything, any kind. That's the first thing. A British soldier is not normally all that observant. And he has to be trained that anything that he sees may well be of importance.
Yes.
Then he had to be trained, his marksmanship had to be improved. If you were to take on a terrorist organization, especially one like that, organized and trained by grievers, your chance of getting a shot are rare, and when it is, it's momentary. So your marksmanship has got to be of a very high standard if you're going to hit them.
Field Marshal, could I just ask you one thing? Do you agree with Lord Harding that the British soldier is basically, unless specially trained, rather unobservant?
Oh, entirely.
Really?
Yes. Yes.
Even in Welsh Race?
Even in Welsh Race. I was going to just add one aspect, if I may, on the training side. We set up, do you remember, that joint army-police school in order to try and teach the junior leader level of both the police and the army more about each other. And get them jointly involved in what was a joint operation, and also to encourage the growth of friendship between the two, which is equally essential. And that was a great success.
Yeah. Now, it seems to me from what you say that there are 2 problems now that have to be addressed, both of them problems of communications. That is to say, how you put your philosophy over to the soldiers and commanders on the ground, and how you explained it to the outside world. So, in other words, your internal and your external communications. How did you go about telling the commanders and soldiers on the island what you wanted and what your philosophy was?
Well, the first thing is I held periodical meetings of the security committees. In each region, each district, there was a security committee consisting of a soldier, a policeman, and a civil administrator. And I had regular meetings, periodical meetings with them, and told them what my policy was, answered any questions that they might have to raise about it, and consistently made the point that the policy must be understood and acted upon all the way down the line. That's one thing. The other was that I spent as much time as I possibly could getting around, and I'm a great believer that commander has to see and be seen himself. After all, command is, in my view, is a very, very personal matter. It comes from your own head and your own heart, and your own enthusiasm for the job you're doing. And that is a very personal thing. And you only do that by getting around, seeing people, taking every opportunity, asking them if they know why you're here. I mean, if I went to a battalion where there was training going on, I would take the opportunity of talking perhaps to a squad of young chaps who were being trained at NCOs, doing an NCO's course, and ask them, why are you here? What are we trying to do here? And that gets passed round in that unit.
Can I just put one point to you both, which is very relevant to what you've just said? I saw this from the other end. I was commanding a company of infantry on the island at the time. And one of the things, of course, which I'm sure you both know about, is that when a general commander comes down to the unit, you usually get about a week's notice, and everything is very carefully organized. I won't put it any higher than that. Did you feel that you could get through this and actually get to the private soldier and the junior commander on the ground?
Right, I think so. Yes, it depends on your personal methods of doing things. I mean, everybody has a different technique for that sort of thing. But you must be able to talk to the private soldier, and you must be able to listen to what he has to say. But you don't necessarily agree with what he has to say.
Yeah, but so often, John, on your visits, and my supplementary visits, the troops were actually on operations, and one would go from helicopter to truck to helicopter and talk to the chaps actually doing the job. So there was little chance of bull and those sort of...
What steps did you take to instill what was obviously some much needed enthusiasm into the civil administration?
Oh, by talking to them, by explaining to them what the policy was and what the part they had to play in. As I just said just now, I mean, the forestry department, the agricultural department, for example, the educational system, which is particularly important, because the Greeks had penetrated all their schools. You see, the educational system in Cyprus was, unfortunately, I think, on a racial basis. There were Turkish schools and Greek schools. And the great many of the Greek schools had masters who came from Greece.
Yes.
And so they were highly indoctrinated with the ethos philosophy and doctrine. And so you had to deal with it.
John, if I could interrupt.
Yeah, sorry.
It was John's personality that had this marked effect on the administration. They hadn't had leadership like this before. And he got their confidence so soon. And he explained the policy clearly to them. And this opened up their eyes, and things pretty rapidly started to change.
You see, you get a chap, you ask somebody for information about so-and-so, and the ordinary reply of a civil servant, the colonial civil servant anyway, was, well, I'll draw the papers. So my retort to that was, I don't see any something papers. I want you to tell me yourself what is happening.
Yes. The other aspect of this communications problem, which I mentioned, external or communications or information services, did you have a big job to do putting those in order?
Yes, very much so. They were hard. They were pretty well non-existent. I don't know I don't know whether the governor ever saw the press or talked to my predecessor or talked to them. Certainly there was a gap between the press, the media, and so on, and the administration. And we tried to put that. We got appointed a director, I think we called him, didn't we, of information.
The Director General of Information Services.
Yes.
Where did you find him?
We found him from the Foreign Office.
I see.
And I used to make a point of seeing in leading correspondents, representatives of responsible newspapers and so on. I get them to come and have a drink with me in the evening and give them have an hour and a half talk with them.
Now this leads us on, I think, to a very important point, which I think, in which I think the views of both of you would be terribly interesting to junior and senior commanders today, quite apart from the Cyprus history. What is your view about the extent to which you should communicate with the press and the media, the extent to which you should take them into your confidence? And more especially, about the level at which there should be contact with the press and the media. Do you have any views about that?
Yes, I have very strong views, and they stem really from the teachings of Monty. I think that when Monty took over the Eighth Army, for example, in the desert, he then taught us not only how to communicate with our own troops, but how to communicate with the outside world, and through visits of the press. And I think when you watch a program now of a young NCO in Ulster being interviewed by a pressman, they're brilliant. And this all stems from a longish period of a growing experience in this field in the Army, and the realization of its importance. I don't mean to say you want to spend all your time doing this sort of thing, but everybody wants to be able to talk to representatives of the press with confidence in the job they're doing and enthusiasm for it. And that's what tells.
That's very interesting, because you will remember, Field Marshal, better than I do, that as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, it was practically unthinkable for anyone to talk to the press except through a specifically designated PRO, Public Relations Officer. Do you agree with Lord Harding that this is...
Entirely. I remember well when the Northern Ireland trouble started in '69. We were getting a bad press. An incident would take place in the street, a riot or whatever, and a local priest might be immediately interviewed by one of the television media. And you would get a biased, probably, report. And what one wanted so badly was the counterweight. What did the local chap in charge, was he a subaltern or a sergeant or a corporal even, what did he have to say? And it took an awful lot of fighting with my political masters to get this agreed and acceptable. Eventually, we did, and as John said, I think it was with tremendous success. Most impressive, a lot of these young men, talking immediately about an instant.
Yes.
They had to be taught and trained, of course, that they mustn't get involved in other issues like a political situation.
This is the danger.
This is the danger of it. But I think that, and again, this question of taking the press into your confidence. I've always gone on the principle that I take the press into my confidence up to the absolute limit that I think security demands.
You both brought up in what you've just said the question of your political masters and political support. Coming back to Cyprus now, did you find that in the years of your appointment as Governor and Commander-in-Chief that you had the political support that you felt entitled to?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think Lennox Boyd was Colonial Secretary the whole time that I was Governor in Cyprus, and I had the fullest support from him, and he responded immediately to any requests or recommendations of mine. The problem really was communicating with him. I used to have to go down to the GHQ in Cairo, and he had to go into the vaults in the War Office, as it then was, in order to be able to talk together on the blower.
Yes.
But that we got put right.
Yes.
I mean, there was no. I mean, one glaring example. When we went there, I found that the ciphers were kept in a safe in the governor's loo, and he was the only chap who had the master, whatever it's called.
Yes. Yes.
To open the thing.
Yeah. The question of the techniques and the philosophy of all this is something that I'd like to go into a bit more deeply with you in the second of these programs. But I think what it would be interesting for people to know towards the end of this one is some of the points about your personal position. What kind of security did you need? What kind of danger were you yourself in as Governor and Commander-in-Chief, and how did you face it? How did you deal with it?
Oh, they had three or four goes in me. I mean, they put a bomb in my bed, which I slept on all night successfully, because the time pencil, the detonator, the chap had torn off the wrong strip. Instead of a 12-hour strip, he'd torn off a 24-hour. My wife likes to believe that he did that on purpose, so that I shouldn't be blown sky. Both of us would have been blown sky high. And then there was a plan to poison the milk coming in. But one had, my the head of my private office, a chap called Tom Acton, he was responsible for my personal security. And of course, moving by helicopters are vital in this sort of situation, not only to reintroduce surprise into the battlefield, so to speak, but also for communication. And if you use a helicopter to get around, you don't have to have escorts and things like that, and it's much more secure. And then I had we brought out, I think you know, we brought out a police unit, very strong reinforcement of police to build up the morale and efficiency of the police from UK constabularies. And they were splendid, magnificent lot of chaps, and they did wonderfully well. I had 3 metropolitan policemen as a sort of bodyguard, and going on Sundays for a picnic on the beaches, they'd pick me up and carry me under their arms. But so I never had any real concern about my personal security. I had some concern about my wife's security and my staff's security. But personally, no, I mean, you can't let a thing like that bother you.
But Field Marshal, as Chief of Staff, you must have felt a great responsibility for the actual personal safety of the governor. How much of that was
I did,
in your mind?
and Tom Acton and I used to discuss this in great detail and frequently, and with the Chief of Police, too. And from time to time we made modifications on it, but he was always a risk.
Of course, the extent to which a governor or a president or a head of state is at risk is sometimes partly a function of his own activities and personality. I should think Lord Hardinge was a fairly difficult chap to make secure, wasn't he?
I think he was fairly obedient.
Was he? But did you in fact have to deploy much in the way of physical resources, soldiers and police and so on?
Well, the government house was guarded by soldiers, and there was an armoured car escort when he went by road, but as John has said, whenever possible he'd go by helicopter, landing in his garden at one end and maybe up in the mountains or whatever at the other end.
Yes.
So this was reduced.
And what instructions did you issue, or what policy did you follow regarding the personal security of the families and dependents of soldiers and sailors and airmen on the island? Did you have any special policy or thoughts, ideas about that?
Yes, and the degree to which they really had to be careful varied according to the political situation. For instance, just before the Suez business, there was a lot of difficulty here. I discussed the measures we should take in some detail with the Chief of Staff of GHQ Middle East here, because they had the large preponderance of families, and we produced between us guidance as to what they should do and what they should not do. And as I say, these used to vary from time to time. And on the whole, I think these worked reasonably well. We had got a secure system called a keep system planned if things really had deteriorated, where the families would be concentrated and more or less tied to their houses. We didn't, in fact, have to implement that. We planned for a worse situation than in fact happened. But they were a responsibility,
Yes.
very much.
Do you think that it's ever arguable that one should not have families and dependents in a situation like this? They should just be removed and let the soldier get on with the job?
Well, it's better. It's more economical to do that. But of course, on the other side of the medal, in order to get to know the country, to know the job, you want the troops, a unit, to be there on site for a year at least. Better still, 2 years. And this was the benefit of the 2 years of the national service system. But it's very hard to, if you have family separation for 2 years, then you're creating other problems, administrative and social problems, which are probably more difficult to solve than the one of having families with you.
Well, in the second of these programs, I want to ask the two field marshals for their views on one of the great controversies that surround this kind of operation, that is the political and the military solution. Can you have a military solution to an internal security problem? Can you have a political situation without, first of all, a military solution? We'll be returning to that in the second of these two programs.